the 9th century BC, merchant ships from the Phoenician city of Tyre first landed on Manaine's shores. They found the islands to be inhabited by a people remembered to history as the Manine, seemingly related to the Berbers of Libya. According to legend, the Tyrians were attacked by a Manine tribe and marched through Magona's arid west for 5 days before the goddess Astarte herself appeared before them in what is now Oliveira, splitting Agula rock with an axe and creating the source of the river Starte, and commanding the settlers to follow the water and settle where it met the sea, founding the city of Masira. The Phoenicians gradually established forts and harbors along the coast of the newfound territories, to serve as a midpoint between their western colonies and their metropolis by Mount Lebanon. When Tyre was subjugated in the 6th century, the lords of the colony of Yankartu successfully defeated its neighbors and united the isles, declaring themselves kings of Manine. Under Yankartu's rule, the islands were troubled by conflicts with the Manine, as well as foreign threats from Sicilian Greeks and the Carthaginians. However, Yankartu also became a hotspot for the Iberian silver trade, bringing a major source of wealth to the small kingdom. Greek settlers came to found their own cities under Yankartu's rule, and Decay quickly grew into one of Magona's most prominent settlements. The discontent of the great Phoenician cities at Yankartu's rule eventually boiled over as Queen Umashtat of Masira allied with the Carthaginians and launched a rebellion to overthrow the Yankartu kings. With the assistance of the Punic fleet, Umashtat was successful, and Masira became the new seat of Manine, albeit as effective vassals of Carthage. The Masirans allowed the Greeks of Manine to remain on the islands, and they came to be an important minority during the Carthaginian period, assisting in wars against the Sicilians and Romans. Yankartu also remained a key harbor for the isles, albeit secondary to Masira. Menane prospered under the Masiran kingdom, and the Manine of the northern hills were gradually assimilated into the broader Phoenician culture. It was also at this time that Menaner cherries became a profitable trade good in the Mediterranean, as Punic merchants would bring the fruits to Greece, Italy, Egypt, and beyond. Though it can be grown outside of Menane, it ripens slower and is of inferior quality, allowing the Isles to retain their monopoly on the product for millennia to come. In the Second Punic War, the kingdom of Manine was occupied by the Roman Republic. It was initially allowed to remain autonomous as a client kingdom, but after the Roman annexation of Carthage, the Isles were incorporated into the province of Africa. Coming to be known by Roman settlers and administrators as Insula Mennaina, the major cities would quickly become Latinized, though its rural interior remained a stronghold for the Punic language until the Islamic conquests. Mennaina came to develop a distinct regional identity, utilizing Punic iconography alongside the Latin language and calling many synchronous Puno-Roman gods by their Canaanite names. Many literate Punic speakers of the island wrote their language in a modified Latin alphabet, known as the Nishara script. Menaner cherry production ramped up during Roman rule, with cerejeiras being established as a cherry farming community. When Christianity spread through the empire, Menane came to be converted from the influence of neighboring Carthage, but many Punic pagan practices remained popular with the locals. The decline of the Roman Empire created an era of turmoil in Menane, which was conquered by the Vandals in the 440s. Vandalia neglected Menane in favor of Sardinia, and Arianism did not make much of an impact on the island's religious backgrounds. Donatism, however, did, and the religious conflict became widespread in major cities. Much like the rest of the former empire, Menane suffered greatly from the collapse of Roman authority, and would not recover for some time. Byzantine reconquest did not particularly help the isle's situation either, and in 699 the Umayyad Caliphate crossed the sea from Tripoli and conquered the Isles. The Umayyads and their successors were successful in restoring authority to Menane, though the local Christian population was wary of their new Muslim overlords and of the new jizya taxes. Though, compared to the mainland, Menane was somewhat slow in its Islamization, and in many regions the locals were given more autonomy than in other parts of the Caliphate. Many Berbers from Christian kingdoms like Auras and Kabawan moved to Menane to escape the Islamization of their society, becoming the ancestors of the modern Aranine people. Many Italian Jews also moved into the Isles, as the newly springing cities of the east were a more tolerant place for their people than their home back north. Medina was founded as a capital for Islamic Menane, and Badra and Hakul quickly grew into prosperous centers as well. As the lowlands of Magona were slowly converted and its people gradually adopted an Arabic as their first language, the opposite happened in the northern region of Colonialism. Latin Christian Menainers consolidated their small communities, and with no major cities or population centers, it became difficult to govern from the lowlands. In spite of the shock from such a drastic societal and religious shift, however, the Islamic period was overwhelmingly positive for Menane, and saw its recovery from the collapse of the Roman Empire and the introduction of much wealth and culture to the Isles. Due to Menane's low strategic value and the difficulty of its administration, its rulers were generally not very dependent or involved in mainland politics. This allowed Menane to escape much of the turmoil of the fragmentation of the Islamic world, as the local Islamic elite would pay lip service to whoever ruled Ifriqiya while continuing to govern its own local affairs. In 1148, however, the Normans of Sicily invaded and conquered the former Roman province of Africa, and though they would quickly lose control of their mainland holdings, their rule over Menane would prove permanent, bringing an end to the Islamic period in its history. Upon Roger II of Sicily's death, his son William took the throne in Palermo. His bastard half-brother Simon, who some were conspiring to enthrone, was given Menane to rule as a count in 1160, away from the center of power of the realm. The new count, himself not particularly interested in usurping his brother, took to the position truthfully. Under his reign, the Jerusalemite Knights of the Holy Sepulchre were invited to set up in Colonialism, founding Fort St. Alexander in the small town of Ikaba, from which they would operate their missionary work. With the Norman Condé court moving from town to town and often finding hostility with the local Arabs, a more permanent capital was required, and a castle soon began to be erected around St. Alexander, centered around a magnificent royal flower garden. The new court and the city that sprung around it came to be known as Castelo das Rosas. Until its completion, the court would instead operate from the town of Fuale to the north. Simon was successful in appeasing the Menaner Latins, as investment and power flowed into Colonialism, and many of the rural poor flocked to Castelo. The Menaner language also became a secondary tongue of administration after French, and many locals acquired powerful posts, and some even married into the Sicilian nobility. The Muslims, however, were greatly angered by the invitation of the Knights of the Sepulchre and the moving of power to Colonialism, despite Simon's attempt to placate the Muslim population with some religious concessions. He would die in 1171, leaving the crown to his eldest son. Though Simon was a tolerable ruler for the Muslims, his son Bohemond was not. A fervorous Catholic, the new count began prohibitions on the use of Arabic in parts of Menane, and attacked Muslim noblemen and gave their titles to Christians, and strengthened the knights as a Menaner military order. It was under his reign too that the construction on Castelo's citadel was completed, and the royal court formally moved into its walls. In 1177, his appointed governor of Medina was assassinated, and the region of Shama burst into rebellion against the country, proclaiming their rulers as emirs of Medina and kickstarting what came to be known as Bohemond's War. The rebellion claimed Bohemond's life, and at an inopportune moment. His son and heir Simon was not in Castello, but in Palermo with King William the Good. At a time of crisis, Bohemond's second-born, William the Pious, took the crown and descended upon the rebels with the help of the knights, destroying their army in the Battle of Peonia, and moving in to occupy Medina. The city was sacked and almost entirely destroyed, and most of the survivors were forcefully converted to Christianity and sent east, where they would found the city of Ubada. Despite the brutal nature of the conflict, William proved a more tolerant ruler than his father, though not more than his grandfather or his uncle in Palermo. The remaining Arabic pockets of Shama would be slowly Latinized as Christians from Colonialism moved south, and as missionaries preached to the locals, and as opportunities of trade and posts of an administration incentivized many to learn the Menaner tongue and convert to Christianity. With Medina destroyed and no city rising to replace it, there was nothing the Menaner Arabs could do to challenge Norman rule. Shortly after the end of the war, William's brother Simon returned to Sicily. With another civil war looming so soon after the previous one had claimed the life of their fathers, the two brothers chose instead to compromise on the Isle's future. William was to retain his title as Count of Mennaine, as by this point he was extremely popular among the nobility for his victory, but his elder brother was given lordship over the large region of Aguila, and proclaimed its Viscount. This was the first instance of the use of the title of Viscount or Visconti being used in Mennaine, though a united Aguila would not last. Simon's sons would split the Viscounty, with Frederigo becoming Prince of Amilcarta, Simon the Junior becoming Lord of Lucia Inferior, eventually coming to be known as Colinas Simoninas and even later Simonina, and his eldest Henry becoming Lord of Oliveira. William would continue to have a successful and prosperous reign until the age of 61, passing the crown to his own son, William II. This is, if you're keeping track, the fourth William in this story so far. William II's reign, starting from 1224, was tumultuous for the metropolis in Sicily. The kingdom was fought for by the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire, bringing chaos to the island. In the turmoil, Manine escaped the wrath of the Italian powers and became a functionally independent realm. There was never a grand proclamation of independence. Rather, the Maniner counts simply stopped paying taxes to Palermo, and its warring kings simply pretended not to notice. William also oversaw the foundation of Ravenna, an administrative center for the region of Pesces that would soon grow into a key fort in southern Magona. Over the decades of rule of the two Williams, the Norman aristocracy gradually assimilated into the local culture, from marriage with Mennainer royalty as well as from practical administration. Though the dynasty retained their French character and pride in its origins, every succeeding count had more ties to the land and was more fluent in the language. So much so, in fact, that it was not questioned when Count William II gave his firstborn son the Mennainer name of Francisco, instead of a more traditional Norman alternative. Upon his father's death, Francisco would ascend the throne in Castello. Initially an unremarkable reign, waters would turn in 1258 when Manfred Hohenstaufen usurped the throne of Sicily. The Pope, still in bitter conflict with the dynasty, retaliated by revoking Manfred's title as King of Africa, effectively confirming Menaine's already informal independence. The Sicilian king attempted an expedition to the Isles in response, but Francisco successfully defeated his forces in Sabra Bay. With the greater troubles at home, the Sicilians abandoned the expedition. The very next year, Francisco succumbed to fever, with his heir still underage. Francisco's wife Siena ruled as the regent for the young Count Eshemon, but the boy's sudden death left Siena the crown until 1266. The Countess's death muddled succession matters even further, with House Hauteville no longer having a clear head. More troublingly, Ravenna had become a home to a wealthy cadet branch of the dynasty, threatening Castello's dominance over the realm. The county almost fell into civil war until Prince Arimano of Ravenna, with the aid of the lords of Simonina, marched into Castello with an army and an offer of peace. The surprise attack proved successful, and the young prince asserted his position as Count of Mennaine, while the Castello branch of the house was instead granted the prestigious title of Viscounts of Colinas. 4 years into his reign, Mennaine participated in the Eighth Crusade, capturing the Isles of Santo Domingo, Carolina, and the Kirkenaars. He died in 1299, succeeded by the weak and malleable Simon II. Gerba and the Kirkenaars were quickly reconquered by a recovering Hafsid dynasty almost immediately upon Simon's coronation. With the new count's weakness and the growing power of the aristocrats, Ravenna stagnated. This would be the beginning of centuries of decay of Hauteville rule, as the aristocracy and the local lords and princes would act almost entirely independently of the crown. Of Arimano's successors, those who tried to restore the power of the crown were quieted, until in 1375 the aristocracy went a step further, simply deposed the uncooperative Count Eshemon II, replacing him with a Castelline puppet. This marked the beginning of the Signoria, where the capital had virtually no power in the country. Instead, the rising triumvirate in Badra, Yancarto, and Cerejeras competed for Menaine's markets in the Pepper Wars, allying themselves with foreign Italian powers and fighting Barbary pirates without the court's aid or supervision. In 1562, Count Francisco IV passed away, and his firstborn took the crown as Isabel III. Born of a Castilian father and a Rabbinine mother, the child inherited the lands of both branches of House Hauteville. Nevertheless, almost 2 centuries of signoria had left the crown a powerless husk, and none believed that the reunification of the house would change this, and at first they were proven right. In public, the count allowed his puppeteers to run the nation for him, but in secret he would conspire against them with minor lords and princes who wished to take their place. Playing the masses, he forced the abdication of the Lord of Santo Domingo, taking the small island for himself. 3 years into his reign, he assisted the Knights Hospitaller against the Ottoman siege of their hold in Malta, being hailed a hero at home and gaining the favor of the Spanish. From the back of this victory, the young count demanded the resignation of Prince Usobal the Cruel of Badra and proclaimed the city to be the new capital of Manine, giving the title of prince to his son Kashtum. This, of course, sparked a war against the powerful eastern city, soon to be allied with the neighbors of Ubada, Brescia, and most notably Cerejeiras. Thanks to his years of conspiracy, the lesser nobles of Shama rose to his banner, and facing attacks on all mights, even mighty Badra failed to resist. Cerejeiras, standing alone, soon surrendered, and Isabel proclaimed the restoration of order to the Isles, claiming his new reunited house, the Alta Villa Brasina. He would spend the remainder of his realm consolidating his gains and rooting away the power of the nobility, freely disposing of nobles and replacing them with trusted men. The Viscount of Colinas, previously a powerful figure under the Signoria, was deposed and replaced with the Count's brother Ferdinando. Upon Isabel's death, his son is crowned Kashtum I, and his title of Prince of Badra is abdicated in favor of his own son, Isabel the Younger. This established a precedent for the title to become equivalent to heirship, similar to the British Prince of Wales. In Manine, however, many regions are still ruled by local princes, so the broader title of prince itself does not necessarily indicate inheritance. The Ottoman Empire, upon the death of the Spanish-backed Count Isabel, sent an ultimatum to Manine in retaliation for their part in the war in Malta. With little hope of defeating the empire and with little wish for war, Count Kashtum accepted Turkey's demands. Those were, however, not actually particularly harsh, as they were mostly intended to stop future Manainer naval threats to Tripoli and bring the Sultanate a diplomatic victory. In fact, Manaine's new status as a de jure Ottoman tributary gave it some legal protection against Barbary piracy, though the Turks would fail to enforce their vows for the time being. It was only after a conflict with a Tripolitanian pirate fleet that successfully captured the island of Ashameda before being repelled by a joint Manainer and Venetian expedition that the Ottomans began to crack down on piracy coming from Libya. Following his coronation, Isabel the Younger began to root out the administrative power of the lords altogether, keeping their titles as ceremonial and ultimately subject to a series of appointed viscounts that would govern Manaine's regions as established provinces. This system would prove much more effective and give Badra power over the farthest reaches of the archipelago, and is still used in some capacity to this day. Cerejeiras was bestowed to the court's personal trusted friend Kemston Croven, of Westphalian origin, after which the island of Krobania was renamed. His son Andrea was notable for spending much of his early years not in Badra, but south of the Fork, in the hill fort of Ashamunaga. From his time there, he had learned the Manine language of the local Oranine Berbers, and was soon sent by their people as, to an extent, one of their own. His brother Enrique, meanwhile, governed Peixes as its viscount. Upon their father's death, Enrique attempted to usurp Andre's crown, but was defeated in the Battle of Artemobile and exiled to Naples. Returning from Ashamunaga, the new count worked to warm relations between the Latin Manainers and the Oranines. He was wed to an Oranine noblewoman from Ashamunaga, and by the end of his reign, Manine became a secondary official language in the viscounties of Chaminina and Santo Sebastiano. His son Isabel fell down the stairs and died only 2 years after his coronation, leaving Andre's next eldest son, Simon, to take the crown as the 6th. The following decades were peaceful, if not uneventful. In 1651, the island of St. Bartholomew in the Caribbean was purchased in an attempt to establish a small colonial empire of the somewhat impressive might of the Manainer fleet, but after the settlement's failure, it was sold to the Maltese a mere 2 years later. In 1683, the Great Turkish War began between the Ottomans and their European rivals, and the Countess Sienna II brought Manine to the conflict. Capturing Tripoli and Djerba, the Maneiners' force was surprisingly successful, though partly because of Venice and Spain posing more serious threats to the Turks. Sienna passed away before the war's conclusion, but by 1699 the Maneiners entirely stopped paying tribute to Istanbul. In 1796, Countess Luana I died in Ubada, leaving her son to claim the county as Simon IX. In France, revolution began to brew, and with French incursions into Italy, the Maneiners sided with Britain for protection. The Royal Navy sent troops to occupy the islands for its strategic position close to Sicily, and ended during Henrique III's rule in 1814. The short-lived British rule was actually quite influential for Manine, leading to the establishment of a Maneiner parliament and the introduction of more capitalist economic elements, replacing the remaining feudal structures. In the year of revolutions in 1848, Remain was too rocked by conflict. With the rebels capturing Ubada and flooding the streets of Badra, Count Henrique was forced to accept the rebels' demands as of a liberal constitution. The parliament was strengthened and the state was secularized, and many new elected local government positions were established, such as provincial intendants and town local governors, known as urban ministers. With a new constitution came a new flag, removing the Cross of Jerusalem from the national banner. In 1860, the Expedition of the Thousand saw the Kingdom of Sicily conquered by Sardinia-Piedmont, a key step in Italian unification. Some Maneiners saw themselves as Italians and wished for unification, some others saw themselves as distinctly Sicilian, and others still a group separate from either. For fear of Italian annexation engulfed many, including the heiress Countess Jezebel II. To counteract this, the government began to heavily fund art and culture unique to the Isles, bring back ancient Maneiner iconography from its Punic past, promote Manine as a second national language, and standardize the Maneiner tongue. Generally, the goal was to foster a Maneiner national identity, not as a subsect of Italians but as the last of the Africans, the heirs of the Roman province rather than Italia. This movement was not exclusively government-backed, as much of Maneiner nationalism sprung up as a natural consequence of Italian unification, but the efforts of Count Jezebel and her associates undeniably aided the cause. However, even with a rising tide of nationalism, Manine still felt threatened by the expansion of the Italian kingdom. This pushed them towards closer ties with the British, part of which included the Prince of Badra Henrique IV being wed to Louise Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a daughter of Queen Victoria. The long-lived countess would only pass her crown in 1899 to an already aged Henrique. Only 2 years later, he would die and pass his throne to Arimano V. In 1911, Manine allowed Italian ships through their waters in their attack against Ottoman Libya, partly to protect themselves from Italian aggression and partly in a move against their long-standing Turkish enemies. To secure their own independence, the Maneiners signed a treaty of neutrality with the Italians, and with a British guarantee, secured Italian recognition of their sovereignty. This would, however, be challenged in the near future. Though avoiding the hardships of the Great War, Manine was not as lucky in the second. After occupying French Tunisia in 1942, Mussolini's Italy sent an ultimatum to Manine, demanding effectively complete Italian oversight. The impossible terms were, of course, rejected, and Italian troops soon landed in Flavia. Thanks to both heavy British assistance and the efforts of the Maneiner troops in the ground, the Italians were unsuccessful in conquering the Isles completely, though bombing campaigns were conducted in Badra, Castello, and Yoncarto. Most of the Maneiner Jews of Matabaru Island fled the country to America, though some failed to do so and were sent to Germany by the Italians. By the war's end, tens of thousands of more Jews were left Manine to Brazil, America, and Israel, though some remain in Badra to this day. The war devastated the health of Count Giorno I, who was absent from politics for much of the 50s and 60s. Prince Simon of Badra acted as regent in his stead, overseeing the rebuilding of the country as the Marshall Plan brought Manine into close ties with the United States. Some of the country's Jewish refugees returned after the war, though their population never recovered to pre-war levels. The majority of Manine's Sephardic Jews now live in Cabo Frio rather than Hakul. Simon would take the crown as Simon X in 1977. During the mid-20th century, many communist and socialist movements sprung up in Manine, and in the 30s many of these consolidated into the Menainers People's Party. After the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, the PPM split in half, with the anti-Stalinist Workers' Party, PDL, eventually outgrowing the original group. The PDL eventually grew into a center-left social democratic organization, leading to another moderate socialist splinter group called the Bandeirantes ascending as their new opposition. In the right, however, the liberal conservative Republicans became a prominent force from the 60s through the 80s, before being largely replaced by the more socially conservative moderates. Despite this, post-war Manine grew into a very liberal society, especially for the southern Mediterranean. The Knights of the Holy Sepulchre remain active in St. Alexander to this day, though of course now serving as a religious charity rather than a militant knightly order. Nevertheless, they have become somewhat of a political symbol for parts of the Christian right, leading to the foundation of parties such as the Sepulchres. However, the Knights themselves were not pleased by this arrangement despite their own conservative nature, as they wished to remain separate from national politics. This led to a lawsuit in the 80s that forced the Sepulchres to rename their organization to the Holy Cross Party and drop the Sepulchre's helmet from their logo. In the modern age, Manine has become quite a prosperous little country, joining the European Union with Malta in 2004 and the African Union in 2006. Manine in the early 2000s had warm relations with both sides of the Mediterranean. This would come to change from 2011 to 2015 with the European refugee crisis. Though relatively few migrants came to Manine, it was still a contentious issue in the country, and caused a huge surge of right-wing populism. Many of these simply became new voters for the moderates, though some went further, to either join the Holy Cross or even create their own parties. Most of these would fail and quickly die, but two of them became major issues in the late 2010s. The Kingdom of God, or the RDX, was a neo-fascist organization that wished to expel the Libyans and the Jews from Manine and Europe in general, hoping to create a pan-European white ethno-state. Although minuscule in numbers, they were linked to a number of murders and hate crimes from 2017 to 18, and were subsequently banned from operating as a political party and deemed a terror cell. Even more fringe, the Regnum Africanum was a revanchist movement that wished to establish a Christian theocracy in Manine and return Latin rule to Carthage. They too were banned after assassinating the Tunisian ambassador to Manine in 2016, and most of their leaders were arrested and tried. In 2021, Simon X passed away in his 80s from COVID-19, leaving the crown to his firstborn daughter, Sienna III. The young countess has, as been true of her predecessor, not directly taken part in the running of the nation, and instead acted as a ceremonial monarch. Instead, the true head of Manine is the Prime Minister, Domenico Jose, who serves also as the President of the Menainer Senate. As Princess of Badra, Sienna had studied in the Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, and now as Countess is a popular figure around the country. And this is where we find ourselves today, the PDT-led Senate and a moderate opposition, at least for this electoral season. The future of Manine seems, for the moment, quite tranquil, as the tourism industry rapidly recovers from the recession during COVID-19.